The fundamental misunderstanding in music theory is due to the fact that there are two different systems that are both being taught at the same time. Both of these systems attempt to make sense out of our 12-key Western music theory model, but the two systems cannot coexist with one another. If you are not aware of which system you are learning from, you will inevitably experience confusion along the way. The two systems that we're talking about here are the 12-key model and the 24-key model. The 24-key model, also known as the 30-key model, states that there are major keys and there are minor keys, each of which are inherently different from one another and each of which follow a different set of rules. The 12-key model, on the other hand, also known as the 15-key model, states that there are no major keys and no minor keys. Instead, we just have keys, each of which has 7 possible perspectives, otherwise known as tonal centers. Now, you may be thinking that this is the type of argument that only huge music theory nerds would concern themselves with, kind of like that Brian Kelly guy that runs that zombie guitar website. However, that is not the case at all. This is actually a very serious bottleneck in the way that music theory is learned, taught, and communicated between musicians. Some information sources operate under the assumption that the student subscribes to the 24-key model. Other information sources assume that the student subscribes to the 12-key model. Considering the fact that the 24-key model is so prevalent in the Western music world, there is a high likelihood that this is the default model that you are currently operating under. If you take absolutely nothing else from this video, at the very least you will have an awareness of the fact that there are two different models that are being taught. So let's first talk about the 24-key model, otherwise known as the 30-key model. This is the model that most musicians in the Western music theory world think that they are following. This song is in the key of G major. That song is in the key of D minor. I'm using the minor pentatonic scale here. I'm using the major pentatonic scale there, etc., etc., etc. The implication here is that there are two different sets of rules that you need to follow depending on whether the song takes place in a major key or a minor key. The 7 notes that are found in any given major key are determined by choosing one of the 12 possible starting notes and then playing the major scale from that starting point. Playing the major scale from that starting point will give you a set of 7 unique notes. Those 7 notes would be considered to be the in-key notes for the key that you are playing in. For example, the 7 unique notes that are found in the key of C major are determined by looking at the C major scale. The 7 unique notes that are found in the key of G major are determined by looking at the 7 notes of the G major scale. And so on. Now, because there are 12 possible notes for which you could start on, there are 12 possible major scales. And by extension, that means that there are 12 possible major keys. So where do we get this 15 major key thing from? So the way that we arrange keys is by how many sharps or flats are found in the key. As you move around the outer circle of the circle of fifths, you continue to add a sharp each time. Theoretically, you could keep adding sharps until you have a total of 7 sharp notes, which yields 7 potential sharp keys. If you again start at the top of the circle of fifths and move in the counterclockwise direction, each key will add an additional flat note. Again, you could keep moving around the circle of fifths in the counterclockwise direction and adding flats until you have a total of 7 flat notes, yielding 7 potential flat keys. So, 7 potential sharp keys, plus 7 potential flat keys, plus the 1 natural key that doesn't have any sharps or flats in it, which is the key of C major, that results in 15 potential major keys. So another thing to keep in mind when you're determining the 7 unique notes for any given key is that you have to have all 7 notes of the musical alphabet present. A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. You also typically don't want to mix sharps and flats together. That's why we have sharp keys and that's why we have flat keys. Now, most of us modern Western musicians have come to an agreement that 3 of these 15 major keys are a bit redundant and not used very often. For example, the key of C sharp major, which is the one key that would have all sharp notes, may seem a bit odd because you don't usually see the note E sharp and you don't usually see the note B sharp. Instead of calling it E sharp, we just call it F. Instead of calling it B sharp, we just call it C. Therefore, you could take this key of C sharp major and make it slightly less confusing by instead referring to it as the key of D flat major. For this reason, the key of C sharp major isn't used very often, but the key of D flat major is. So instead of saying that this is 2 different keys, we just think of this as one key. This is known as an enharmonic equivalent key. There are 3 of these enharmonic equivalent keys, and they are all found at the bottom of the circle of fifths. So for the sake of simplicity, most of us just say that there are 12 major keys instead of saying that there are 15. Up until here, the 12 key model and the 24 key model are in perfect agreement with one another. So let's now talk about minor keys. A minor key is formed by taking any of the 12 possible major scales, or 15 if you include those extra 3 enharmonic equivalent keys, and you lower the 3rd, 6th, and 7th note by 1/2 step. For example, if you took the 7 notes of the C major scale and you lowered the 3rd, 6th, and 7th note, you would have C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat. This new scale is called the C natural minor scale. This is now the new default scale that is used to determine the chords for the key of C minor. Under the rules of the 24 key model, there are a few things that are now done differently in a minor key that are not done in a major key. For example, when it comes to creating melody lines in a minor key, it is common to use any one of 3 possible minor scales: the natural minor scale, which we just talked about, or the harmonic minor scale, or the melodic minor scale. The harmonic minor scale is derived by taking the natural minor scale and raising the 7th note by 1/2 step. The melodic minor scale raises both the 6th and 7th notes of the natural minor scale. These additional 2 scales are used because the raised 7th note leads nicely back to the 1st note, also known as the tonic of the minor key. It's also very common to take the 5th chord in a minor key, which is a minor chord, and turn it into a major chord, or in 7th form into a dominant 7th chord. Dominant 7th chords are great second to last chords to play in a song or chord progression because they lead very nicely back to the 1st chord of the key, otherwise known as the tonal center chord of the key. For example, listen to a G minor chord moving to a C minor chord. Now listen to how it sounds when you instead play a G dominant 7th chord right before the C minor chord. Making that alteration by changing the G minor chord, which is part of the key of C minor, and changing it into a G major chord or a G dominant 7th chord, it helps to strengthen the feeling of resolution once that final C minor chord is played. So using 3 different minor scales and making this alteration to the 5th chord are both common practice for minor keys under the 24 key model. So let's now talk about the 12 key model, otherwise known as the 15 key model. In this model, there are no such thing as major keys or minor keys. Instead, there are just keys, and there are 12 of them. Again, if you include those enharmonic equivalent keys, you could potentially have up to 15 keys, but for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to say that there are 12 notes in our Western music system, and therefore there are just 12 possible keys. The 12 key model is in complete agreement with the 24 key model as to how the major keys are formed. The primary disagreement stems from the fact that those additional alterations that are typically made to minor keys under the 24 key model are not actually requirements to play or write music in a minor key. Instead, if you make any of those alterations to quote-unquote minor keys, then they introduce out-of-key notes, otherwise known as accidentals. Under the 12 key model, the harmonic minor scale introduces 1 out-of-key note. Under the 12 key model, the melodic minor scale introduces 2 out-of-key notes. Or if you take that 5th chord in a minor key, which is a minor chord, and you change it into a major chord or a dominant 7th chord, then you are introducing an out-of-key note, which means that this chord, this altered chord that you're using, is an out-of-key chord. The 12 key model is purely mathematical and provides simple yes or no answers to everything. Something is either in key or not in key. If a chord contains just 1 single note that is not part of the 7 unique notes found in the key, then that chord is considered to be an out-of-key chord. Now, as we discussed previously, the natural minor scale is derived by taking the major scale and lowering the 3rd, 6th, and 7th notes by 1/2 step. So, under the 12 key model, instead of treating this newly formed scale as something that is entirely new and something that adheres to a completely different rule set, the 12 key model simply acknowledges the fact that those 7 notes are the same 7 notes as one of the 12 possible major scales. The major scale for which these 7 notes are the same as is the E flat major scale. The 7 notes that are found in the key of C minor are the exact same 7 notes that are found in the key of E flat major. And by extension, the exact same 7 chords that are found in the key of C minor are the exact same 7 chords that are found in the key of E flat major. Therefore, under the 12 key model, E flat major and C minor are considered to be the same key. Likewise, the key of C major, which is the one key that doesn't have any sharps or flats in it, would be considered to be the same key as the key of A minor, which is the minor key that also doesn't have any sharps or flats in it. The key of C major and the key of A minor have the exact same 7 notes as one another, and the exact same 7 chords as one another. Therefore, under the 12 key model, we refer to these as the same key. For any of the 12 possible major keys, or 15 if you're considering enharmonic equivalents, there is exactly one relative minor key that shares the exact same ingredients. The same is true for the minor keys. For every one of the minor keys, there is exactly one major key that shares the exact same notes and chords. For this reason, every single relative major-minor pair is simply considered to be one key under this model. Now, under the 12 key model, we do acknowledge the fact that musicians are always going to use the terms major key and minor key. However, whenever we are in a quote-unquote minor key, we are always aware of the fact that the relative major key is the same key. For example, if you played the song Build Me Up Buttercup, which is in the key of C major, and then you played the song Stairway to Heaven, which is in the key of A minor, in your mind, you would think of both of these songs as being in the same key. However, you may still communicate with other musicians using the musician lingo and refer to Build Me Up Buttercup as being in the key of C major and Stairway to Heaven as being in the key of A minor, but ultimately you realize that these are the same exact key. So let's talk about some common conflicts between the two systems. Under the 24 key model, you may see the 7 chords in the key of A minor labeled as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. However, under the 12 key model, you would first of all recognize that these are the same exact 7 chords that are found in the key of C major. And then second, you would number these chords in one of 2 possible ways. Number 1, you could use major perspective numbering. This is where you take the major chord, the first chord, as if you were treating this as a major key, and you apply the number 1 to that chord. You then number the rest of the chords in the key accordingly. The other way to number chords under the 12 key model is to remain consistent with the natural minor scale formula, which is 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. Under the 12 key model, we acknowledge the fact that it is often convenient to renumber the chords to accommodate for the tonal center, which in this case is the A minor chord. So we're essentially saying we have this key, the A minor chord is the tonal center, therefore that's the chord that gets assigned the number 1. But then when you number the remaining 6 chords found in the key, it remains consistent with the scale formula. The main benefit of this model is that it always maintains mathematical accuracy. Under the 12 key model, the major scale is the one and only default scale from which all other chords and scales are derived from by using scale formulas. Under the 24 key model, on the other hand, you have the major scale, which is the default scale, but then you also have this natural minor scale, which is sort of like another default scale. Now, you can't have 2 different default scales. Therefore, the 24 key model will not always maintain mathematical accuracy. So let's look at a very simple example of how you might see this come up in practice. Take the final 3 chords of the rhythm section for the Stairway to Heaven solo. Now, from the 24 key perspective, you might see this progression labeled as 1, 7, 6. But from the 12 key perspective, you would see this labeled as 1, flat 7, flat 6. Again, the flat symbols in front of the chords serve to maintain mathematical accuracy with the natural minor scale formula. If the A minor chord is being labeled as the 1 chord, and the distance between the notes A and G is a minor 7th interval, otherwise known as a flat 7 interval, then it makes logical sense to assign the label of flat 7 to the G major chord if you are calling the A minor chord the 1. This maintains the intervallic relationship between the notes and the chords. The same is true for labeling the F major chord as flat 6 as opposed to just 6. So as you sift through the various YouTube videos and websites, you will see different teachers using different numbering systems to label chords. At the very least, make sure to be aware of whether the teacher is teaching you from the 12 key model or the 24 key model. That will significantly help you to make sense of the numbering system that they are using. So being unaware of whether you're learning from the 12-key model or the 24-key model can be especially confusing for guitar players. Let me give you an example of why. So as guitar players, one of the most common scales that we use is the pentatonic scale. Under the 24-key model, you will usually have two different numbering systems for the 5 positions of the minor pentatonic scale and the 5 positions of the major pentatonic scale. They are essentially treated as two entirely separate scales. Now, under the 12-key model, there is no major pentatonic and no minor pentatonic. We just call it the pentatonic scale. The 5 notes of the C major pentatonic scale are exactly the same as the 5 notes of the A minor pentatonic scale, and that is because the key of C major and the key of A minor are a relative major-minor pair. Under the 12-key model, we just refer to this as one single key, one single pentatonic scale. Now, the 12-key model does acknowledge the fact that the minor pentatonic scale and the major pentatonic scale do in fact have two different tonal centers. And the mathematical reasoning as to why minor pentatonic sounds different from major pentatonic can be explained through the use of scale formulas. So in order to determine the notes of any chord or any scale through the use of applying the scale formula, you need to have a default scale for which to reference it to. And that default scale is always the major scale. The major scale has the scale formula 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Therefore, if you wanted to know the exact 5 notes of the C major pentatonic scale, you would first start with the C major scale, which has the scale formula 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and you would drop the 4th and 7th notes from that scale, which is what the major pentatonic scale formula tells you to do. That's how you arrive at your 5 notes for the C major pentatonic scale. Now, if you wanted to determine the exact 5 notes of the A minor pentatonic scale, you would again start with the default scale. This time we're trying to determine the notes of the A minor pentatonic scale. Therefore, we would start with the A major scale. The formula for the A major scale is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. You look at the 7 notes of the A major scale. Each of those notes can be replaced with a number. From there, you then do what the minor pentatonic scale formula tells you to do, which is to eliminate 2 of those notes, and then flatten the 3rd and 7th note. The result is now the 5 notes that are found in the A minor pentatonic scale. This right here is one of the main benefits of the 12-key model. Under the 12-key model, we have only one default scale. That default scale is the major scale. That default scale gets the scale formula 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. From that one default scale, we can determine the notes for any chord or any scale simply by applying the scale formula. So let's talk about modes now. So there are only 2 certainties in life. Number 1, we're all going to die someday. Number 2, if you play guitar, then you're going to argue with another guitar player about modes at some point in your life. The obsession with modes in the guitar community is a thing that will never go away. Now, without getting too far into this modes madness, simply put, the 12-key model provides all of the answers to the modes debate in the guitar community. On the other hand, the 24-key model has a major bottleneck. Under the 12-key model, we have exactly 12 keys, each of which contain exactly 7 notes. In any given key, each of the 7 notes are representative of a chord. Therefore, you have exactly 7 chords in any of the 12 possible keys, each of which could potentially be the tonal center of the key. In any given key, you have exactly 3 major chords, 3 minor chords, and 1 diminished chord. All 12 keys work exactly the same as each other, and in any given key, you will find these exact same 7 chords. A mode is simply the sound that is created when you take one of these 7 chords that are found in any given key, and you make that to be the tonal center of the key. Again, any given key has exactly 7 chords in it, therefore any given key has 7 potential modes, 7 potential tonal centers. You could replace the word mode with the word mood, and it really wouldn't have changed the meaning that much. As previously discussed, there are only 12 notes in total in our Western music system. When we reduce it down to just 7 notes, which again are determined by choosing any one of the possible 12 starting notes and then playing the major scale from that starting point, that is how we get our key. A key is what allows us to create beautiful music that is pleasing to the ear. Let's say that you have 2 guitar players. One is the rhythm player and the other is the lead player. Both guitar players are playing in the key of G major, so guitar player number 1, who we're going to call John, strums chords at random, which are all part of the same key, this key of G major. Guitar player number 2, who we're going to call Sarah, noodles around over top of what John is playing, using only the 7 notes of the major scale for the same key that John is playing in. The outputted result from John and Sarah's jam session is music that sounds pleasing to the ear. The reason for this is due to the fact that both players were playing in the same key as each other. In other words, they were both limiting the pool of notes that they were using to just 7 notes, which have been determined based on the key that they were playing in. Taking this concept a step further, let's now say that John wants to start producing different moods within the same key that he was previously playing in. He still has the same pool of 7 chords to use, but he just wants to play something a bit sadder now. So as John strums this sadder sounding chord progression, Sarah will again noodle on her guitar in the exact same key, using the exact same 7 notes that she was before. This time, the outputted result has a much sadder vibe, which is just what John had intended. Sarah's playing simply emphasized the vibe that John had created with his chord selection. As one final example, John wants to create yet a different vibe from both of the previous 2 examples. Again, he wants to remain in the exact same key, which consists of the exact same pool of 7 chords. And again, Sarah will noodle around on her guitar in the exact same key as she has been all along. This third example had yet a different vibe than example number 1 and 2 did, but the key has not changed between any of the 3 examples. So why did each of these 3 examples seem to have an entirely different vibe? The answer to that is because the tonal center, also known as the mode of the key, was different for all 3 examples. All 3 examples were played in the same key, consisting of the same pool of 7 chords and 7 notes. It's just that the tonal center changed from example 1 to example 2 to example 3, resulting in 3 different sounds that were produced. So each of these 7 chords is a potential tonal center of the key. In any of the 12 keys, chord number 1 always equates to Ionian, chord 2 Dorian, chord 3 Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian. Therefore, example number 1 could have been labeled as an Ionian chord progression because its tonal center was the first chord within the key. Example number 2 could have been labeled as an Aeolian chord progression because its tonal center was the 6th chord within the key. Example number 3 could have been labeled as a Dorian chord progression because its tonal center was the 2nd chord. Under the 12-key model, we have remained in the exact same key the entire time. Each example was simply a different perspective of the same key, a different tonal center, a different mood, a different mode. Under the 24-key model, which states that there are major keys and there are minor keys, each of which are inherently different from one another, there is now added complexity. Under the 24-key model, we may have labeled example number 1 as being in the key of G major. No problem. Example number 2, key of E minor. No problem. What about example number 3, though? Could we call that the key of A Dorian? Well, under the 24-key model, most people will say that keys are not modes. Keys are something different. So, example number 3 could not have been in the key of A Dorian under the 24-key model, since no such key exists. Therefore, in order to try and assign labels to the chords that were used in example number 3, which again were just A minor to D major, this progression may have been said to be in the key of A minor with a borrowed D major chord. The D major chord could have been said to be borrowed from the parallel key of A major. Now listen, if the music produced sounds good, then it does not matter at all how John or Sarah chooses to think about what they are playing. But for the purposes of communicating between one musician and another, and for the purposes of teaching people to understand how to use and apply music theory, the 12-key model provides logical explanations to all of the questions that will inevitably come up as you progress through your learning journey, especially when it comes to this whole modes debate. The 24-key model adds unnecessary complexity to that which is extremely simple. The fact that this 24-key model has been driven into the minds of musicians for centuries only serves to amplify this confusion. You've been told that 24 keys is the way, yet when you try to put the pieces of the modes puzzle together, you will always arrive at this exact same bottleneck. To put that bottleneck into clearly defined words, it goes like this. If we take the first chord of a key and we make that the tonal center, the sound of the music produced is called an Ionian chord progression. This could also be labeled as a major key. If we instead take the sixth chord of a key and we make that the tonal center, the sound of the music produced is called an Aeolian chord progression. This could also be called simply a minor key. Now, if we take the second chord of a key and we make that chord out to be the tonal center, the sound of the music produced is now called a Dorian chord progression. But this does not get the privilege of getting to be called a key. Instead, it's just called a mode, or a Dorian chord progression. Now, all chord progressions are technically modal chord progressions, but only Ionian chord progressions get the special privilege of also getting to be called a major key. But then, when you get to these Aeolian chord progressions, which is just taking the sixth chord of a key and making that out to be the tonal center, that also gets the special privilege of getting to be called a minor key. Only Ionian chord progressions and Aeolian chord progressions get to be called major keys and minor keys. Why? Under the 12-key model, modes are simply just a different perspective of the key, and there are 12 keys in total. Again, the reason as to why each of these modes has a different sound from each other can be explained through the use of scale formulas. Remember, the 12-key model heavily emphasizes the fact that everything is mathematically accurate. So if you look at the scale formula for each of the 7 modal scales, you'll see that each one is significantly different. You have your note, which you are considering to be the tonal center, the 1, and then your other notes in relation to that 1 have a specific intervallic relationship as defined by the scale formula. That intervallic relationship with the tonal center, the 1, is the reason that each mode has a different sound to it. In fact, you could look at the scale formula for any scale that you want, and that scale formula is the reason why it sounds the way it does. But this always keeps in mind that the major scale is the one and only default scale from which all other scales are compared to. So let's actually listen to what each of these 7 scale formulas sounds like back to back. We're going to use C as our tonal center. In other words, we're going to make C to be the 1, and then we're going to apply the scale formula. C Ionian produces a different sound than C Dorian, which produces a different sound than C Phrygian. And this can all be explained by the scale formula. This is the mathematical reasoning behind it. This is known as the parallel relationship between modes. However, this does not change the fact that the relative relationship also exists and serves to provide logical answers to everything pertaining to modes. When you look at the 7 modes in parallel to one another, as we previously did, those are 7 different keys. Each one of those modes is coming from 7 different keys. When you look at the modes according to their relative relationship, as we're doing now, this is all the same key, under the 12-key model at least. Under the 12-key model, we try to minimize the use of the term major scale and minor scale as much as possible. We instead just use the term diatonic scale. The diatonic scale consists of the 7 notes of the key that you are playing in. The underlying chord progression, also known as the rhythm section, dictates the mood or the mode of the music. The lead singer or the lead guitar player or the lead saxophone player or whoever the lead player is that is playing the melody line, they use the 7 notes of the diatonic scale as their soloing framework. The diatonic scale that the lead player uses is one of the 12 possible options, and this is determined by the key that the rhythm section has put them in. When studying modes, the 24-key model will leave you wondering why Ionian and Aeolian are so special, but it will never provide you with an answer. The 12-key model, on the other hand, not only answers all of the questions pertaining to modes, but it also significantly simplifies the way that music theory is taught as a whole, because everything makes 100% mathematical sense. If you think that I'm a bit biased towards the 12-key model, you're right. However, the primary purpose of this video is simply to bring to your attention the fact that there are these two conflicting models that are being taught. Regardless of how much information you were able to understand and retain from this video, at the very least you are now aware that there are two different models of music theory that are being taught. Zombie Guitar teaches from the 12-key perspective. It has been that way since day one, and it will never change. If you are new to Zombie Guitar, then it is very important that you understand the baseline starting point from which everything else is derived. Getting this one bit of information sorted out right from the start will significantly shorten your learning curve. And that is the fundamental misunderstanding in music theory. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. See you next time.